From the Annie E. Casey Foundation, I'm Lisa Hamilton, and this is CaseyCast. Today, we welcome Lawrence F. Katz, the Elizabeth Allison Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Professor Katz is a distinguished scholar whose work spans labor economics, social issues, and the relationship between education and technology. Along with Amy Finkelstein of MIT, Professor Katz was the co-founder and co-scientific director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which is often referred to as JPAL North America. JPAL is at the forefront of using randomized evaluations to inform policy and reduce poverty. His research on neighborhood poverty, wage inequality, and the long-term impacts of fair housing programs align closely with our work at the Casey Foundation. Professor Katz, welcome to CaseyCast. We are eager to dive into your insights on how research can drive meaningful change in communities across America, a topic I'm sure we could talk about for hours. Well, I want to start by talking about social research and how research and evaluation helps us know what works.
So I think to both have better policy and to bridge large partisan divides, evidence is really necessary on what types of policies are effective and evidence on what are really, the important problems that we should be addressing. And one thing, that I have learned both in my experience in government when I served in 1993-94 as the chief economist of the U.S. Department of Labor, working in the Clinton administration, for example, and with people in the White House on the National Economic Council, is that evidence from sort of what we think of the gold standard of randomized control trials, which is what's needed, if you want to put a drug on the market or for our health, we always sort of use those now. That's what the FDA, needs to approve, whether there's a new vaccine, that, similar evidence for social programs and, environmental policies is very helpful and powerful. And so it's sort of crucial in order to create opportunity, reduce poverty, have thriving families, to have our policies be well informed by credible evidence. And in many cases, a randomized control trial where in the US, and many programs are rationed where you essentially use a lottery who gets access. So you clearly can tell the different outcomes for people who get the program versus don't tell you about what the actual effect of the policy is. Otherwise, one always worries about confounding factors. The type of people who entered a training program or an education program might just be different and would have different outcomes otherwise. The randomized controls trial naturally creates a control group who is the same up to the luck of the lottery or the draw.
Right. Although I will note, as an organization that is involved in this work, the research rarely tells us yes or no. There's often lots of nuance to it, and you have to understand for whom it works and how long does it take for it to work and how long might the effects last, et cetera. So could you talk a bit about these studies aren't necessarily exactly like drug trials where it cured the illness or it didn't, but it gives us lots of information about for whom something might work.
They are similar to drug trials in that all these same questions also apply to drug trials.
True. That's true.
What dosage? We tested at one dosage. Right. Should someone who weighs 280 pounds have the same dosage as someone who weighs 140 pounds?
Right.
It worked on adults. Will it work on kids? I mean, all these questions are also true of drug trials. When I took over as the chief economist of the U.S. Department of Labor, actually, it was the first one there ever was that we invented the position in 1993. We did a large review of past government training programs and all the randomized trials and other evidence. And we saw things littered with sort of mediocre, moderate sort of effects that often they had short-run impacts. They got people into jobs a little quicker, but they're jobs they could have gotten anyway.
Otherwise.
But we started also seeing that there were several programs that had much bigger and long-lasting effects, and it showed up in several trials, and they seemed to have certain characteristics. They really worked closely, and we came to call them sectoral employment training programs. They worked closely with a group of employers in sort of an industry locally to try to figure out what are the jobs that they were looking to hire now that had upward mobility prospects, paid high wages, but also were likely to last. They designed training to be broader than a single employer who could then just sort of exploit the workers, but gave you a certification of skills that, a whole industry or a whole sector looked at. And they had a bunch of wraparound services. Once we have gotten you placed in a job, there's a time period we help out. And what we saw is programs that had this sort of characteristic, they weren't for everyone. You had to have, a reasonable level of literacy and numeracy to sort of get through the initial screen, show up, but they were paying off. And now we have about a dozen randomized control trials with programs like Year Up for young people that started here in Boston, Periscolas in the Bronx, the Project Quest, which, works in healthcare with a lot of single mothers in Texas, that after the training was completed, placing people into much higher wage jobs that were very different than the types of jobs the control group got, because they were breaking down barriers, getting skills, and they were raising earnings 30-40% that we see now persisting over a decade in the programs we've been able to follow. And we sort of see the characteristics. You can have all these characteristics, but train people for jobs that aren't very high wage, and it doesn't do very much.
Mm-hmm.
You can have all the screening and placement you want without doing the training to get you up to those jobs. It doesn't matter. And it's very difficult without sort of creating connections with employers to overcome distrust of hiring people who might look different than the people you would normally hire. So having credible evidence from a group of randomized control trials on different populations, you could see which methods seemed to work and which methods didn't in a very scientific way. And I think that's some level of what we try at JPAL North America to encourage a lot of them and just think about synthesizing the evidence. And there are a number of other organizations in the US, I think of MDRC, Mathematica, app, that similarly have been building up the evidence in this area.
Well, that was an eloquent explanation of both how the research happens and what it tells us, and how it's in many ways iterative, that we learn something and it might lead us to ask more questions, that this continual process of learning really does help make for better social policy, and I would argue better philanthropy, because not just policymakers are following the research results that you have, but also in philanthropy, we are following it and trying to contribute to it because we want to invest in things that work. And so let's dig a little deeper into JPAL, the organization that you're a part of. What led you to create this research lab? And you're obviously studying lots of issues around low-income children, families, communities. Why is that the animating question of a lot of the work that you do?
Yeah. So JPAL existed and was largely working around the world in developing countries doing randomized control trials, founded by Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee and Michael Kremer, former students of ours and Nobel Prize winners, and Emily Nathan. And Amy Finkelstein, who was a former undergraduate student of mine at MIT, and I got to thinking, and Amy really pushed this, that there are a lot of organizations like MDRC and Mathematica that do great work, using randomized control trials, but it's difficult for academics to get connected with them, who also have a lot of ideas and might also be able to connect more to a broader economic research community. And while academics sometimes did randomized control trials on important policy, when we had talked to colleagues who tried to do this, they thought these were amazing projects where they'd learned a ton, but it was just really hard. Everyone was reinventing the wheel every time they tried to do a randomized control trial. They had to figure out how to get through the institutional, the IRB, how to collect administrative data to follow up, how to sort of figure out statistical power. So there was very little infrastructure for academics to do this. And we had talked to a number of great scholars who said, yes, I'd done this, was amazing, but I would never do it again because it just sort of took so much time. So we thought, why don't we sort of, create both a network of people so that best practices would be disseminated, but also have a staff that could help deal with this is how you deal with the following issues of institutional review. These are the ethical issues you're going to face. And there were important things that people found hard to do, like the wrong way to think about setting up a research program is you have some idea from up high, you're a scholar, and you just go out and you test it. You actually need to interact with the community and have
Right.
connections. When we were designing Movie to Opportunity and then creating Moves to Opportunity, it wasn't that, we just said, oh, this is how to,
This
help
be
people with
interesting.
different areas. We actually spent a lot of time talking to people who had been in housing voucher programs about what were the main barriers. Where did they want to move when they had a voucher? What were the barriers? Was it financial? Was it information? Was it landlords wouldn't accept them? And so we felt that this was the hard part, that having a group that really provided that infrastructure, research management, setting up collaborations with more qualitative researchers, getting you connected to partners could really facilitate more research using the most credible research methods on social policy and poverty issues in the United States. So that was our motivation back in 2013.
So then, Dr. Katz, you all have created an infrastructure through JPAL that allows you to do more academics to really be involved in this research process and to connect them to communities in ways that they might not be able to themselves. Talk about why poverty is so central to so much of the work that JPAL does.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were founded and motivated by really issues concerning persistence of poverty in a high income country, in the US and more broadly in North America. We are JPAL in North America. And we've really prioritized research that works up with, more vulnerable communities and how to create both upward mobility for adult, but also intergenerational improvements and outcomes. Because, we really think in the United States and in North America more broadly, inequality and persistence of poverty among plenty is, our biggest, social program. Divides by race and ethnicity also fit in there. And so our hope is to have some of the strongest economic researchers focused on these issues, but also part of what JPAL North America tried to do is expand the network to be much more diverse and not just be people at the top elite universities, and to reach out and to have scholars in every community be involved is another important factor. But I think ever since I sort of got into this business out of concerns, my mother was a school psychologist who worked in sort of diverse and low income communities in Los Angeles when I was growing up. And this has always been, sort of what's motivated me, seeing inequality across communities and groups and the tremendous cost, both to individual families, but to society, just the research looked at and done in the past more macroeconomically on how much of our growth comes from reallocating talent, whether it's determined by the neighborhood you grew up in, your race, or your gender. Not giving opportunities to people are a huge, cost to our society,
Yeah.
and a very large part of growth of the US economy has been because of breaking down those barriers. And in some sense, what JPAL North America does is try to get into the microeconomics and the details of how do you break down barriers to getting into higher wage jobs? How do you reduce segregation by race, ethnicity, and economic status of where people live and what opportunities individuals have? So that's what's motivated us. And while there are other big issues where RCTs are important, the broader healthcare system, environmental climate change, we tend to always, when we're looking at proposals, put a very high weight on the impact on sort of poverty and low income populations.
Well, we would agree that is an essential question for our country to try to figure out what works. And so you have lots of insight on research that suggests what effective strategies are for helping struggling families. Over these decades of research, what are you learning is most effective? Where do we need to be putting more of our bets as a society?
I mean, I think we've learned a lot. We still have a lot more to learn, but I think having a safety net with low administrative burdens that provides some reasonable minimal support, especially to households with children, is sort of essential, to reduce deprivation. Having stable housing is clearly essential, as we've seen, in some of the work we've looked at homelessness and housing instability. So you need a reasonable starting safety net, whether it's through a child tax credit or child allowance, and some sort of clear housing support to set a foundation for families. I think what we're learning is while all that is very important, and it reduces deprivation, which is hugely important, you need pathways to sort of higher wage, higher skill jobs are key for durable long run impacts. And some of that is through reducing the segregation of where people grow up and go to school. We're seeing increasing evidence that giving opportunities for families to move to more integrated neighborhoods and giving children long-term exposure to a more diverse sort of environment, a safer environment, has big long-run payoffs. But it also means traditional education on the margin, getting into a sort of selective four-year public university has a very, very high rate of return.
One of the projects that I think you are most renowned for is something you've mentioned, the Federal Moving to Opportunity Program. You were the lead researcher on that, and many of us have followed it and studied it to inform what we do. Tell us a little bit about what the Moving to Opportunity Program was about and what your key takeaways were.
Yeah. So Moving to Opportunity is a federal demonstration project that went through the Department of Housing and Urban Development and started in 1994. And what it did is it tried to see if you help low-income families living in high public housing projects in high poverty areas who are interested in trying to take their housing support and make it more portable and move to sort of lower poverty, higher opportunity areas. Is that both feasible, given what you could rent on a Section 8 or now Housing Choice voucher? And does that matter for their current economic opportunities and long-run outcomes for their kids? We have a lot of evidence historically that families living in more advantaged or safer neighborhoods do better, but one always worries that there are just unobserved differences between families growing up in more advantaged areas. They have greater wealth in many ways. They're more motivated parents. So we designed this as a randomized control trials, given we have in the US, we ration vouchers. So we essentially, for a brief period following the Rodney King Los Angeles riot in late 1992, Congress was a bit focused on the issues of segregation, of trying to find strategies to help families in the most high poverty areas in the US. And so an urban bill was passed and there was some demonstration money. And in the early part of the Clinton administration, we had interagency group and we sort of borrowed some ideas that had been floating around from a lot of housing advocates. What if we could truly test trying to help families with housing vouchers move to lower poverty areas? And that was the origin. It took place in 5 large US cities: Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York City. Eligible families were living in public housing in highest poverty areas of the city, so greater than 40% poverty rates. Those interested were randomized among getting a regular Section 8 voucher, which in many of these cities had like 8-year waiting lists to get, or getting a voucher plus support to move and a restricted voucher to a low poverty area under 10%, or keeping your regular public housing support. And so we've been tracking those families for a long time. There were about 5,000 families, 1,000 at each site randomized in the program. And the first thing we found is that about half the families who got the sort of experimental voucher that tried to help you move to a low poverty area were successful at moving. That was actually higher than we'd anticipated when we set it up. And so it was possible. And over the next 20 years, you see that they do some moving around, but on average, they're living in areas with poverty rates, if they move from this program, about 18 percentage points lower, than the control group. So it changed their environment. They're living in safer places and in lower poverty places. And what we found in the short run from moving to opportunity, which a lot of people found disappointing, but I found very interesting, is it looked more like what you might call moving to tranquility
Mm.
than moving to opportunity. That is, in the short run, families were much happier. They were safer. You were seeing health benefits for these were largely, many were, families that were single female headed, but, married also. But the adults were sort of reporting less stress. But by itself, it didn't change the economic circumstances of the families. And the kids were safer, staying out of sort of violent crime. They were less victimized by crime, but you weren't seeing a lot in traditional test scores from the outcomes. But once we were tracking it over time, what we started seeing is the effects, on the adults persisted. Health improved. There were big reductions in depression and in extreme obesity.
Mm.
Didn't change their economic outcomes that much, family income. But for the kids, once you followed up later, the kids who moved at younger ages and got long exposure to the neighborhood, when we see them as young adults, were earning 30-40% more. They were much more likely to go to college. When we're looking at the next generation, their kids are growing up in bigger circumstances. And so what it seems to be is that having exposure to safer, lower poverty, higher opportunity neighborhoods has very big long run impacts on kids. The way I think of, the evidence we've seen there, and then a lot of work that my colleagues, Raj Chetty, who's a former student of mine, my colleague at Harvard who works for Opportunity Insight, and Nathan Hendren, who've worked with me on moving to opportunity. We've also, the availability of sort of big data, they'll be able to link families to their locations and their sort of history of earnings through tax records now and census. We've been able to look at millions of moves of families across different neighborhoods and areas. And what you see is, for children, there is really this exposure effect. The longer time you're in a more diverse, higher upward neighborhood, the bigger the sort of payoff.
So, as an organization that does lots of work around neighborhood transformation, for just the reason you talked about, that where children grow up makes a huge difference in their lives, we do work to try to improve disinvested communities. This project focused on a certain set of families who are getting vouchers who have the possibility of moving to another community. Tell us what your take is on this research in terms of neighborhood effect and what we ought to do. There are certainly families who are going to move, but also families who are going to stay and need
Oh, yeah.
stronger neighborhoods. So what is your recommendation you give folks about sort of neighborhoods and how we can make sure the most number of children can grow up in
Yeah.
healthy places?
So I think of mobility policies, that is, giving families who have housing support greater assistance to move where they want to move, for the families, as a complementary strategy to investing in more disadvantaged neighborhoods and trying to improve them. So if we give more opportunity, and that's sort of our second stage of our research, creating moves to opportunity that we've been working on, is sort of trying to figure out what the barriers have been to moving and how do we overcome them. What we've seen there is that with a modest sort of investment in sort of mobility counselors relative to the cost of a housing voucher, I can increase the likelihood that a family that wants to move to a higher opportunity area. We did this in Seattle and King County, from about 10 to 15% without sort of extra help, for maybe $2,500 on average of sort of help on security deposits, counselors, and others. We can raise that to 50 to 60% are able to sort of move to higher opportunity areas. So that's the first part, making sure that families who want to live where is affordable and more integrated neighborhoods. That then also puts more pressure on landlords in
Mm.
less advantaged areas to try to keep people there by providing, better quality housing and improving it. So it's,
That's
it
great.
creates
It
a
creates
market
choice.
pressure
Yeah.
of choice so
Hmm.
that you don't know that you can just keep the place, in low
Crappy.
maintenance and get the voucher because they have nowhere else to move. So,
Right.
but we also need real investments, these communities. So when I was working, for example, in the Clinton administration, we were working both on moving to opportunity as one strategy, but empowerment zones as another strategy of directly, not just giving tax breaks to claim you made some profits in a community, but to actually invest in the infrastructure and to sort of bubble up, have the community think about what the barriers to mobility were, have some tax credits for employing people from low income communities, but also invest, whether that's improving the green spaces, creating a safer environment. And so it's tougher to do a randomized control trial. I had argued that when we did empowerment zones that we should have randomized among the finalists. I didn't win among that, but we have sort of quasi-random variation, but comparing the winning communities to losing communities. And we saw there that the communities themselves did improve with investments. But what we were unable to do, this is work that Pat Klein at Berkeley and some collaborators have done. What we were unable to do in the past is see, did it actually make these higher opportunity areas, or did it just change the mix of people living there?
Hmm.
Because we only had repeated cross section. We could look at the census in 1990 and 2000, and we could see people were doing better. But was that
Who were
changing?
it? Was it the
What we
same people?
Yeah, what we can do now is track people, using the links of sort of the census to tax data that we have through census and evaluate policies like empowerment zones or like Hope 6 revitalization projects. That's what I've been recently working on with my colleague Raj Chetty, some other Laura Tack, who's a sociologist at Cornell, Rebecca Diamond, who's at Stanford, a former student of mine, and Matt Stager. We've been sort of linking people over time and seeing when you sort of invest in a community through Hope 6 to try to create mixed income housing and do sort of investments. Does it actually, if you look at the families who then move in, does it actually create higher upward mobility? We can look before and after, see the families, and what did it do for the families who were there before? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to do a ton for the families who were there before. There's such high turnover in such neighborhoods that by the time the neighborhood is revitalized, not a lot of them are there. But for the next cohort that moves in, we're seeing big increases in upward mobility. And in fact, one of the things we're sort of looking at, it looks larger than you would sort of predict from the change in the mix of poverty, because we're sort of seeing that creating integrated housing as opposed to a normal neighborhood that has, a poverty rate of this level, but one group lives in one set of housing, one group lives in another. Creating mixed development seems to create interactions that are very valuable for changing your sort of network. And there are all sorts of interesting new research. One could sort of look at Facebook data in the high schools in these areas and see, in fact, that you're now seeing kids have more friends from different socioeconomic classes than before the change in the neighborhood and the infrastructure, and more than you would predict from a normal neighborhood. So we're still trying to figure this out, but it seems to not have negative effects on the higher SES kids and have very positive effects on the lower SES kids. So that's sort of our hope there, is that you can put some market pressure to improve communities by giving more choice to families there, but you can also directly invest in those communities.
Mm.
And I think we need to do both of them. We're never going to do everything through mobility policies, but we certainly should increase the returns on what we already invest in housing vouchers, for example.
That's great. And I think the lesson from what you've just talked about, so often I have people ask me, what's the one thing we need to do? And there isn't one thing. There are many things we need to do. And I appreciate you talking about how two strategies, empowerment zones and moving to opportunity, were complementary, and we've got to do multiple things. At Casey, we are always trying to find ways to connect young people to family sustaining work, and you have studied many important aspects of this. Could you talk about what we've learned about how to help young people enter and be successful at work?
Yeah, what we've seen from a whole series of randomized control trials over decades of, in some sense, much of the work on doing randomized control trials started in the US with both the negative income tax, which today we call sort of guaranteed income, but also a series of training programs in the sort of 60s and 70s. And then building on that for decades with organizations like MDRC, which started working on supported work in the 1970s with the randomized control trial. And as I said, what you see is traditional programs that sort of train for the available jobs that hire workers without college degrees, have some short run success, but don't create a lot of pathways to higher wage jobs. What we're seeing is that when you work in your regional labor market with trying to figure out with a sector, whether it's, the financial institutions in New York City, as Paris Galas did, in the early 2000s, what were the need for help desk people in IT today, who's going to maintain your Cisco servers and your Apple devices, but being a nimble organization that trains people for what the current skills needed by a group of employers are, and that also teaches soft skills and plays this sort of intermediary role. So you need real training for stuff that's valuable for jobs that have some upward mobility where companies, are finding difficult times hiring people and will be open to sort of people with non-traditional credentials. That's sort of been the sweet spot that is highly effective. And we've seen that in healthcare. We've seen that in manufacturing and Milwaukee, in tech and in business with sort of year up. And so the key questions are, there are a lot of wonderful local nonprofits that have been doing this, but can we also scale this by using the community colleges in the US? I think that's the really where you have a strong education, but creating greater links to employers. And for example, Year Up has been partnering with a lot of community colleges in trying to integrate their sort of connections with employers and curriculum along with traditional community college education. And, a lot of states have been growing their joint programs with high school, community college, and vocational. So I think there are a number of pathways, states like Kentucky and Tennessee have been pretty good at doing this. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the US, but can we leverage, our community college system with local nonprofits that have created connections with employers to create greater pathways to high wage jobs and reduce barriers? And so that's, a key point. The other is, while we've been quite successful with people who have some community college or effectively at least a GED and reasonable levels of literacy and numeracy, trying to create pathways to get there. Can you have sort of a program like a youth build, which, often combines a GED with some other training that may not directly lead to a higher way as a pathway to get into a program like a Periscolas or a Year Up or a community college program? I think trying to get people who would fail the screens initially to get into a sectoral employment program or a well-functioning community college nursing program or something is the other area where we need to be sort of doing research and finding. So right now, our sweet spot are people who are job ready, but lacking those opportunities and providing them the connections and training. But the people who aren't ready for those jobs, yet because they need some further education to get there, or they need some experience, that's where trying to build pathways where criminal records is sort of a barrier. We've also been doing a lot of experiments at JPAL at, can you work with employers or placement groups to reduce the sort of screening on criminal records and make employers more comfortable with giving opportunities to workers they might have just screened out initially. That's another area that, given the US history, is a very important one, given the large number of low-income workers who have some blemish on their record who may get screened out. So that's another very important area.
That's great. Well, I have to tell you, JPAL is in some ways invisible but essential infrastructure for social change in this country. And we are so thrilled to have you as a partner and to be able to learn from what you are doing. I'm wondering if you have any last thoughts about how those of us who are trying to make the world a little better for kids and families and communities can learn from and work with your work. What advice or encouragement would you give to those of us in philanthropy or policymakers or even practitioners about how best we can use what you're learning and how we can contribute to additional evidence building in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have tried at JPAL North America to also have a very strong, policy staff to try to disseminate and summarize, work with our scholars to summarize the sort of research and work with policymakers and funders about what we're learning. And I think there's both clearly philanthropy has an important role in funding the basic research that is needed to learn these things and helping scholars and fantastic organizations like MDRC, Mathematica, and others do the type of work that builds our research infrastructure to do more evidence-based work. And then think about prioritizing resources and things where we have evidence that actually are going to sort of be effective, but also I think play an important role in making sure that researchers are listening to communities and you're paying attention, and that feeds in. One huge advantage that social scientists have over, say, like physicists is, I can't talk to a quark and learn much about its motivation, but I can talk to the people in the communities we're working in, and they may use the same terms we would do, but I would put much more faith in trying to test a hypothesis that someone says is related to their own motivations, that one they said they would never think about in a million years or sounds foreign to them. And so the back and forth between the community, funders, and sort of researchers is really important. And one thing we've tried to push at JPAL North America is quantitative scholars doing sort of RCTs should be working carefully both with their communities and with sort of ethnographic qualitative researchers, both to come up with new hypotheses to test and design interventions, but also to interpret what we're finding. Just like in drug trials, maybe you can sort of test the molecular pathway and understand it, but even in drug trials, often you need to talk to people to learn where they're feeling better, what we think is different about the community if we move them, and can we sort of then test the sort of pathways that people think value. And so I think there's really a need for dialogue and back and forth to make progress, and that researchers need to be very much involved with talking with participants. And, I think we all benefit from that, rather than scholars in the academy being divided and just using secondary data sets and not listening to sort of what members of the community think are important.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, I think you have provided us with so much insight on why evidence building is important for anyone who wants to see good things happen and see society improve in this country, ways that we can do that work more responsibly and inclusively to make sure we get better results and to really build on decades of learning that have really helped us understand what does work and what's left still to learn about how to address the big issues of our time, such as poverty. We know that is critical work if we are going to help kids and families have productive lives in this country. And we certainly owe gratitude to JPAL and your many partners and other research institutions for the really important and, as I said, sometimes invisible work you do to help us know how to do that. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights with our listeners and for all the work that you do.
Well, thank you. I greatly enjoyed getting to talk about these important issues.
Great. And thank you to our listeners as well. If you liked our conversation, please recommend us on your favorite podcasting app. To learn more about Casey and the work of our guests, check out our show notes at aecf.org/podcast. Until next time, I wish all of America's kids and all of you a bright future.